These soldiers were deployed as UN peacekeepers. Even after they served in a unit that kills and tortures. They were high-ranking officers of Bangladesh's elite unit Rapid Action Battalion, and in particular, its notorious intelligence wing. In 2023, we revealed, what the government continues to deny, that RAB murders, abducts, and tortures alleged criminals and political opponents.
UN peacekeeping missions cannot have amongst them officers who may have been responsible for these kind of very serious abuses. That defeats the purpose of peacekeeping.
For months, we looked into Bangladesh, one of the largest contributors to UN missions, and found that the two officers were not a unique case. We analyzed classified military personnel files and secret UN deployment lists and found more than 100 soldiers who went from RAB to peacekeeping. Some of them admitted to extrajudicial killings during their time at RAB.
On the day of the execution, the target is taken out with his hands tied and blindfolded.
After the bullet hit his skull, some blood and brain fragments splashed on my uniform.
And yet the officers were deployed on UN missions afterwards. We went to Copenhagen to meet a man who, in 2019, raised the alarm. Jens Modvig served as rapporteur for the UN's Committee Against Torture, and the report on Bangladesh stated it was gravely concerned about RAB's abuses.
The recommendation was that former and current members of RAB should not be allowed to do service in peacekeeping operations.
But we found at least 40 RAB members who were deployed to peace missions after the report was published. Confronted with our findings, UN Peacekeeping in New York wrote, "We do not have the resources to review the information of all personnel deployed, and the vast majority of troops perform well." This former UN official told us that the organization has barely any power over which officers countries select as peacekeepers. Until 2019, Andrew Gilmore was UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and experienced firsthand what happens when the UN pushes countries to exclude possible human rights abusers.
One country that was really important literally said, okay, we're going to pull out altogether. And the UN Secretary General at that time had to go basically to that country and essentially apologize to the head of state. Otherwise, like 4 UN peacekeeping operations would have collapsed.
He wouldn't tell us which country, but said that the UN is stuck in a dilemma. The reason? Faced with dangerous and deadly missions, Western governments increasingly pulled their troops out of peacekeeping operations. Instead, they prefer to pay for them, leaving the supplying of troops to countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Egypt, and China, many of which are known to have abusive security forces.
We get some really pretty useless troops and some pretty brutal ones as well. But if you're still in the UN, you can't actually say that.
We also confronted Bangladesh's government and every individual officer mentioned in this report. They didn't respond.
With me in the studio is Naomi Conrad from DW Investigations. She's one of the authors of that report. Welcome, Naomi. So your report focused on the records of UN peacekeepers from Bangladesh, but are there documented cases from other countries?
So we actually also looked at Sri Lanka. So, I mean, if you look at the list of peacekeeping countries, the top providers are Egypt and China, Pakistan. So take your pick. I'm sure there are quite a few cases in most of these countries. But we looked at Sri Lanka and found at least one case where activists had warned the UN about a specific officer who had been implicated in the atrocities committed at the end of the civil war in 2009. And he was sent despite these warnings. So it's definitely going on. I think if you dig into some of the records of some of these other peacekeepers, you're quite likely to find other cases too.
So the obvious question is, I mean, why is the UN using known human rights abusers as part of its peacekeeping forces?
Well, the UN's hands are tied because they need troops to maintain these peacekeeping operations. A lot of governments have pulled out of peacekeeping operations. I mean, these missions are dangerous. They're often quite deadly. It's very difficult to convince voters in democracies back home that you're sending soldiers and they get returned to you in body bags. So to an extent, the UN is stuck in this dilemma and there isn't really an easy way out.
OK. And what is being done to address this problem? So obviously these issues are now being highlighted. So what's happening? Is anything happening to change it?
There have been cases where the UN's human rights branch has teamed up with human rights commissions and activists, most notably the case that's happened in Nepal. So there are examples, but the problem is that a lot of countries don't actually want that. They don't want external bodies or even their own human rights organisations to look into the past of these soldiers, because at least in the case of Bangladesh, one could argue that high-ranking members of the government are ordering or at least letting these abuses happen, so they don't really want too much scrutiny.
OK. We'll have to leave it there. Naomi Conrad from DW Investigations. Thanks so much, Naomi. And if you want to watch the whole of that DW documentary, just go to our website, that's dw.com, or you can look for our documentary channel on YouTube.